Well, welcome to the chapter on the brain. We're going to start off by looking at the main parts. The brain can be divided into 4 main parts. And we'll outline each of them and then write some notes on it. So we're going to start with the cerebrum. It's this big part up here on the top. This is the conscious part of your brain. So remember when we were talking about somatic and autonomic and visceral? This is the part that deals with your somatic motor and somatic sensory. So it deals with all of the sensory information that you are consciously aware of and all of your voluntary movement of your skeletal muscles. This is also the part that sets humans apart from other animals. You have a much bigger cerebrum with your body size than other animals do. And the cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres. So it has a right side and a left side. And each hemisphere is divided into 5 lobes. And we are going to go over the lobes and the hemispheres later in another video. For now, we're going to go ahead to the next part, which is the cerebellum. So that's this little part back here. And here you can see it in cross section. This part is what coordinates your movements. The fact that you can walk without falling down, the way you move, that's all coordinated through your cerebellum. And just think of a drunk person. The way a drunk will stumble and fall down and bump into things, that's because alcohol inhibits the cerebellum. So compare a sober person to a drunk person to get an appreciation of what the cerebellum does. And it receives proprioceptor information. These are receptors in your muscles and joints. So proprioceptors are sensory receptors in your muscles and joints. And they keep track of where your body parts are. This is something you take for granted. You don't have to really think about it. It's just always been like that. But you know where your foot is right now. You know where your arm is right now. That's your proprioceptors reporting to your cerebellum. So they send info about the position and movement of all your body parts. So for example, when you're walking, you have to coordinate your right leg and your left leg with each other. If they don't stay coordinated with each other, you'll fall down. So your cerebellum is keeping track of where each leg is and making sure they walk in coordination with each other. The next part we're going to look at is the diencephalon, and that is inside. So this area that you can only see in cross section is the diencephalon. And the diencephalon, we're going to look at 3 main parts of it. So first we're going to look at the thalamus. The thalamus is this area right here. And for the function of thalamus, we're going to go over that in class. So just leave some space here in your notes to write in the function of thalamus later. Then we'll go ahead to hypothalamus. So look at your root words. Hypo means below. So the hypothalamus is just below the thalamus. This area is the hypothalamus. This is a part of the brain that's going to come up a lot in future chapters. So we're going to have a lot of stuff coming up next semester with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has 7 jobs. It is in charge of hunger. Whenever you feel hungry, that's your hypothalamus. Also thirst. It's making sure you have enough water in your blood by making you thirsty if you need more. It regulates your body temperature. So like when you're hot and you sweat, or you're cold and you shiver, that's your hypothalamus. Also, when you're sick and you have a fever, your hypothalamus gives you a fever. It regulates your circadian rhythm. Think about if you get used to waking up at the same time every day and then you don't actually need your alarm clock anymore. That's your circadian rhythm. It keeps track of day and night and when you should sleep and when you should be awake. It's in charge of emotional behavior. When you say that you love someone with all your heart, you're lying. You don't love anything with all your heart. Your heart is a muscle that pumps blood. You love someone with all your hypothalamus. It also controls many of your hormones. Not all, but there is a list of hormones that we'll cover in chapter 17 that is controlled by the hypothalamus. And finally, it controls some of your autonomic nervous system, which is what we'll cover in chapter 15. And you did get introduced to autonomic in chapter 12. Then the next part that we have for the diencephalon is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is right under the hypothalamus. So this part here is the pituitary. So the pituitary secretes hormones into your blood, and it does so under the control of the hypothalamus. So this goes along with that number 6 function of the hypothalamus. It controls everything that happens in the pituitary gland. Then the 4th part of the diencephalon is the pineal gland. It is toward the back. So right back here is the pineal. This is what makes you sleepy. The pineal gland secretes melatonin. And this makes you sleepy. You may have heard of this. Melatonin's pretty widely known. You can even go to the store and buy a bottle of melatonin pills to help you sleep. And it does this in response to darkness. So this is why we tend to sleep at night. When it's dark out, your eyes sense that darkness, and that stimulates your pineal gland to secrete melatonin. This is why you might feel sleepy and want to take a nap on a cloudy, stormy day. All that darkness stimulates your pineal gland to secrete melatonin, and you just want to curl up on the couch and take a nap. There is also, you may have heard of seasonal affective disorder. It's abbreviated SAD, SAD. This is when people can actually get depressed in the winter because they have too much melatonin. The winter tends to be dark. The days are short and they tend to be overcast. There's not a lot of bright sunlight. And without that bright sunlight, your pineal gland will just keep secreting melatonin. And so some people find themselves just very sleepy and run down in the winter. And the treatment for that is to buy one of these bright lights. So if you find yourself being tired and run down a lot in the winter, you might try sitting in front of one of these lights, and it gives you that brightness and it shuts down the pineal gland from secreting too much melatonin. All right, then we can move on to the brainstem. So this part is the brainstem. This is also sometimes called the reptilian brain. This is the most basic, rudimentary part of the brain. So it's called the reptilian brain because even reptiles have it. So I said the cerebrum is what sets humans apart. We have a really big, high-functioning cerebrum. The brainstem is pretty much the same in every animal. So there's not much difference between your brainstem and a turtle's brainstem. And we can look at the brainstem is three main parts. So up here at the top is the midbrain. And there are a lot of functions of the brainstem. We're not going to go over all of them. We're just going to keep this pretty basic and simple. The midbrain has your auditory and visual reflexes. When you were a kid, did you ever play that made you flinch game? Where you go up to one of your friends or your brother or sister and you act like you're about to punch them, but then your hand stops just short of their face and they flinch. And then if they flinch, you say 2 for flinching, and then you get to punch their shoulder. That's your midbrain doing that. Or like when you hear a loud sound and you jump, that's your midbrain. It gives you those flinching and jumping reflexes to something coming right at you or a loud noise. Another part is right here. That is the pons. And like I said, there's a lot of functions here, but we're going to keep it pretty basic. One of the main things your pons does is it makes breathing smooth. You can quietly inhale and exhale. You don't even notice you're doing it most of the time. That's your pons making that nice and smooth and quiet. Sometimes people can get damage to the pons and then their breathing is kind of erratic. The third part is right here, and this is the medulla oblongata.
Alligators are abnormally aggressive.
I know the answer to this question. Raise your hand.
Anybody? Anyone? Yes or you, sir?
Mama says that alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
Your mama said alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth and no toothbrush. Wow. Anybody else? Yes or you, sir?
Alligators are aggressive because of an enlarged medulla oblongata. It's the sector of the brain which controls aggressive behavior.
That is correct. The medulla oblongata.
But Mama said...
The medulla oblongata is where anger, jealousy,
So despite what the Waterboy and Colonel Sanders say, the main functions of the medulla oblongata are going to be autonomic control, of three main things. Your heart. Now, a note here, your heart beats on its own. It does not need your brain to tell it to beat. But your medulla oblongata can tell it to beat faster or slower. It also has autonomic control of your breathing and the diameter of your airways. And your blood vessels, when your blood vessels dilate or constrict. Now, there are also hormones that can tell your blood vessels to dilate or constrict. So your medulla oblongata does control blood vessels, but it's not the only thing that controls blood vessels. In addition to this autonomic control, your medulla oblongata can make you cough, sneeze, gag, and vomit. These are all life-saving functions. So coughing and sneezing are to keep your airways clear so that something doesn't clog up your airways and make you suffocate. Gagging and vomiting are so you don't poison yourself by eating something that's bad for you. So if you try to eat something that's going to make you sick or kill you, you'll gag. And if you do manage to get it down, your medulla oblongata will try to make you vomit it back out and protect your body from that. So there is an overview of the main parts of the brain. And then we're going to do more detail on the cerebrum coming up in future videos. Now we are ready to look at the 5 lobes of each hemisphere of the brain. And this is just the cerebrum. So these are cerebral lobes. Notice we don't have the brainstem and the diencephalon and the cerebellum here. So this is that big human functioning part. This is the somatic part of your brain. So this is all your consciousness. The first lobe is your frontal lobe. So I'm going to outline each of them, is here. So this is frontal. And your frontal lobe is the part that has your thoughts and personality. And this is also what makes decisions. And remember, when it comes to decisions, the one thing you get to voluntarily control is your skeletal muscle. So right here, this strip right here is your motor cortex. This is the part that sends the signals to your skeletal muscles. So you also have on your frontal lobe the motor cortex, and this is what controls your skeletal muscles. The next part is parietal. That is right here behind the frontal. Parietal is what has your sense of touch. So remember, this is the somatic part of your brain. So all of the somatic senses are going to be coming here to the cerebrum. And you have a couple of special areas. You have the somatosensory cortex. So that is right here. It lies right behind the motor cortex. This is where all those signals from your skin initially go to. So it receives the signals from your skin. Then you also have a somatosensory association area. This is where you remember what things feel like. So like if it's dark or you have your eyes closed, you can reach out and you can touch something and you can figure out what it is based on touch, because this is what remembers what things feel like. And it helps you figure out what you're touching. All right, if we keep moving around, next we get to the occipital lobe. This is in the back of your head. Remember the body regions? You have an occipital body region. This is where sight is, or vision. And it also has a cortex and an association area. So you have the visual cortex. It receives the signals from your eyes. And you have a visual association area. It remembers things and interprets. So whenever you see something, it's taking what you're seeing now, comparing it to what you've seen before to interpret to what you're seeing. Then if we come around to the side, we have temporal. Temporal has two senses. It has hearing and smell. So it has an auditory cortex. This receives the signals from your ears. It has an auditory association area. So it remembers things you've heard before and helps you figure out what you're hearing now. And then you also have an olfactory cortex. Olfaction is the scientific name for smell. So the olfactory cortex receives the signals from your nose. Then our last lobe is the insula. It is right here. Notice these metal rods here and here that are pulling back the other lobes. The insula is found under your frontal lobe. So if you're just looking at the surface of a brain, you can't see the insula because it's tucked underneath the frontal lobe. And think about it. We said your somatic senses all go here. Which sense haven't we covered yet? Taste. So the insula is in charge of your sense of taste. It has the gustatory cortex. So gustatory is the scientific name for taste. Okay, in addition to these lobes, there's two special areas on the brain that we're going to look at. We have right here this little circle and then kind of this bigger area around it. So these are the Wernicke and the Nostoc. And Wernicke is a German word, so it's spelled with a W, but it's pronounced like a V. The Wernicke is what understands language. So right now you hear me talking, but I'm just making noises is all it is. But these noises that I'm making have meaning to you because your Wernicke assigns meaning to them. And you're looking at my writing on the screen. All I'm doing is making shapes on a screen. But those shapes have meaning to you because of your Wernicke. It's interpreting them as language. The Nostoc integrates information from different senses. Okay, so Nostoc means to know. So this lets you know about your environment. It gives you a big picture, comprehensive sense of your environment. Now we're going to look a little more at the motor cortex of the frontal lobe and that somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. So if you come here, this ties back to chapter 10 and chapter 6. So here on the motor cortex, this goes with what we learned in chapter 10. And here with the somatosensory cortex, that ties back into chapter 6. Okay, in the chapter 6 lab, remember when you did that activity where you had those calipers, that blue plastic thing, and you poked your lab partner and you would move it a little further apart until they could feel 2 points, and you measured the distance between their sensory receptors? that was called the 2-point discrimination test. And we talked about the homunculus. You had that picture of the homunculus in lab. Well, here again, here's that homunculus. So on your brain, all those signals, when you were poking your lab partner, they were going right here to that somatosensory cortex on the brain. And the brain has a map of the body. So for example, if you poked your lab partner on their elbow, that signal from you poking their elbow came into their brain and it went right here to this part of the brain. And that's how they knew you were poking their elbow. If you poked them on the face, that signal from the face would come in right here and it would go right there. And they would feel you poking them just above their upper lip. Right? So you have this map of the body in your brain. So the somatosensory cortex has a map of the body. And this is how you know which part of your body was touched. So for example, if your brain gets a signal right here, it knows that your thumb was touched. If your brain gets a signal right here, it knows that your knee was touched. So this map is how you know which part of the body sent the signal. Now notice the sizes. The face and the hand are really big. And notice like the arm, the torso, the rest of the body is pretty small. According to your somatosensory cortex, your face, look at the size of the face, is bigger than your whole body, your whole torso put together. It's not that your face is actually bigger, but remember how you learned about the distance between sensory receptors? Your face and your hand have the most sensory receptors. You had the smallest distance there. And the parts of the body that are small have the least receptors. So the more sensitive body parts with the more receptors have larger areas of brain that interpret those signals. Okay, then if we go look at the motor cortex. So think about in chapter 10, we talked about motor units. Remember, a motor unit is one neuron and all the fibers it controls. So notice first of all that we again have a map of the body. So the motor cortex right here in your brain has a map of your body. And again, you have these distorted sizes. The hand and the face are big, and the rest of your body is small compared to them. Well, this time the sizes relate to the size of the motor units. So your hand, remember we talked about fine motor skills? Fine motor skills have small motor units. This means there's only a few fibers per neuron. This is the small teams. This is what I represented with a basketball team. So if there's only a few fibers per neuron, in order to control the whole muscle, you need several neurons. Your hand and face are where you have very fine motor control. You can do fine movements with your finger, like writing. Your face makes facial expressions. Think about how much you can read into someone by looking at their face and their facial expressions. So you have a lot of motor neurons to your hand and face. And that's why they are so big on here. All right, so there is more detail of your cerebrum, the lobes of the cerebrum, and some more information about that motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. Your brain is one of the more delicate parts of your body, and it needs to be protected. So the brain is very soft, and it's subject to physical injury. It also is very particular about its chemical environment. Because the brain can be damaged by types of chemicals. So protecting your brain is a big job, and you have 4 things that protect your brain. One is bones. So the bones of your cranium are going to protect the brain from physical injury. You also have meninges. The meninges are 3 layers of membrane. And they help with both physical and chemical protection. You have cerebrospinal fluid. This is a special fluid made from your blood that flows in and around the brain and the spine. And it does both physical and chemical protection. And then the 4th one is the blood-brain barrier. This is special glial cells called astrocytes. And they act kind of like a bouncer, controlling what molecules from the blood get to come into the brain. In this video and in the next video, we'll look more closely at each of these four things. In this video, we're going to go ahead and look at the first two, the bones and the meninges. So you've probably heard of skull and you've heard of cranium. Let's go over the difference between those. The entire thing here is your skull. The skull is your cranium plus your facial bones. The cranium is the part of your skull that encloses the brain. So in this picture, the cranial bones are colored in, and then what's left plain white here is your facial bones. So skull is a more inclusive term. It includes the cranium and the face, and cranium is just the part that's around your brain. And these bones provide physical protection of that soft, squishy brain. Now if we go on and look at the meninges. The meninges has 3 layers. I have 2 different pictures here because each picture is a slightly different. So we're going to label both pictures and look at these 3 layers. We're going to start off with the inner layer, which is the pia mater. So we're going to outline it and then we'll talk about it. So to give you a little context, this is the brain and here is the cranial bone. Actually, this is the bone and this is the skin. So the meninges is what's in between the brain and the cranial bone. So the first layer of meninges is that pia mater. So you can see it's right on the surface of the brain. If we come over here, it's this part here, right on the surface of the brain. You can see it follows down all the little fissures in the brain. Those are the sulci. So our first layer is the pia mater. This is the innermost. It adheres to the surface of the brain. And it is a thin, delicate layer. Then the next one is the arachnoid mater. So it is right here. And then it has this thing here. It kind of looks like a little tree or like cauliflower. It goes on. And it has all these stilts underneath of it. You look at it in this picture. It's this part right here. Here's that little tree thing. It's on this side too. And again, here's all these little stilts underneath of it. So number 2 is arachnoid mater. This is the middle layer. The reason it's called arachnoid, think of what comes to mind with arachnoid. It means spider. All those little stilts under it kind of look like a spider web, and those are collagen fibers. So it has collagen fibers that prop it up from the pia mater. It's like when you go by the Mississippi River, there's little houses there right along the river, and they're usually up on stilts. So that way when the river floods, the houses don't flood. This is what it reminds me of, is those houses up on stilts. The arachnoid mater is elevated up on stilts above the pia mater. And this gives it a look like a spider web. So all those collagen fibers propping it up kind of look like a spider web. And that's why it's called arachnoid, after a spider. This propping up creates a subarachnoid space. You can see it's labeled here, the subarachnoid space. So that's the purpose of these collagen fibers. That creates a subarachnoid space. And this space is where cerebral spinal fluid flows. Then, the little tree-like thing, that is an arachnoid villus. The purpose of that is to drain old cerebral spinal fluid. So with cerebral spinal fluid, you're constantly making fresh and getting rid of the old. And that's how you get rid of the old. Then we can move on to the next layer is the dura mater. And the dura mater has two layers. It's split into two. So we'll get two different colors here for the two layers of dura mater. Here is the bottom part of dura mater, which you can see right there, it's already labeled, is the meningeal layer. Then we have up here the top part is the periosteal layer. So we can come over here and label those in this picture. So this is the meningeal layer. And then the top one here is the periosteal layer. So we'll do a different color for dura mater as a whole. So dura mater is the outer layer. And dura means tough. Think of the word durable. If something's durable, it's tough and it lasts. So this is a tough, thick layer. And it has two layers. So you have the meningeal. This is the layer that stays attached to the arachnoid layer. And then the periosteal is attached to the bone. In most places, these two layers are together. So like you can see here, the two layers are together. So in most areas, the two layers stay together. But then you do have some areas where they separate. So this area here, and you can see it's kind of triangle shaped. That is where they separate, and that is called a dural venous sinus. So at certain areas of the brain, the two layers separate. And they form this triangle gap. And notice there's your arachnoid villus in that dural venous sinus. So this is where your old cerebral spinal fluid goes. It is also how blood drains out of the brain. So the purpose of the dural venous sinus is to drain blood and your old cerebral spinal fluid from the brain. And this ends up draining into the jugular vein, and it goes back to your heart that way. A few interesting points about the meninges. Meningitis, you may have heard of this, is an infection of the meninges. And this can be a very devastating disease. It can come on very quickly. You can be fine 1 minute and dead a few hours later in the most extreme cases. It can be either viral or bacterial. The bacterial one is easier to treat, but the viral one tends to be more mild. And the highest risk group for this is college students. It tends to spread through saliva and body fluids, and college students live in close contact with each other, and they tend to be trading a lot of body fluids back and forth. The good news is there is a vaccine you can get to protect yourself from this. And one of the big warning signs of meningitis is a stiff neck. So it feels pretty much like having the flu, but you have a stiff neck is the key sign. You can also get hematomas. So this would be like if you have a blow to the head, or you have a sudden stop, or like spinning too much, a sudden and sharp turn of the head. Couple of things can happen when you get a blow to the head, a sudden stop, or a sudden and sharp turn. One is the brain can hit the inside of the cranium. And that is a concussion. So concussion occurs when the brain hits the bones on the inside. A contusion is when you get a bruise on your brain from it hitting the bones. And a hematoma is when blood or fluid collects. And this is a problem because it puts pressure on the brain. And the brain is very soft, and this pressure can actually squish the brain. You can see in these pictures where here's the hematoma, and you can see it's actually pushing the brain. The brain's kind of caving in. where that hematoma is. So those can be very dangerous, and they definitely need medical treatment. All right, so there's an overview of the cranium and the meninges. In the next video, we'll look at cerebral spinal fluid and blood-brain barrier. Now we are ready to continue with the things that protect the brain and look at cerebral spinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. In your brain, you have ventricles. These are hollow areas in the brain. And this is where you make cerebral spinal fluid. And within these ventricles, there's a special structure called a choroid plexus. This is made of ependymal cells. You should recognize these from chapter 12. These are glial cells. Remember, glia are the cells that support neurons. So right here, you can see this reddish stuff. That is choroid plexus. And this is located in the lateral ventricle. You have two lateral ventricles, one on the right and one on the left. So blood flows into the choroid plexus. And as it does, the ependymal cells select components of the blood that they want. So they get to pick and choose. They're going to pick things like water, glucose, electrolytes. They're going to pick out the things they want for the brain. And they're going to avoid things they don't want. So they're going to avoid substances like waste products. So then what you end up with is your cerebral spinal fluid. And each day you make about 500 milliliters of this. At a given time, you have about 100 to 150. So you're constantly making new and getting rid of old. So once you make the cerebral spinal fluid, then it circulates through the brain and spine. So if we look at the flow of this circulation, it goes down from the lateral ventricle through the third ventricle. So right about here is your third ventricle, and it comes down to the fourth ventricle. From there, it goes two different ways. Some of it will flow through into the subarachnoid space. So remember, we saw this before, those collagen fibers that hold the arachnoid layer up above the pia mater. That's where this goes, that subarachnoid space. And then you can also see here going down the spine, you have this canal. So some of it will go down the canal of the spine. And this that goes down the spine, when it gets to the bottom, then it enters that subarachnoid space and comes back up. So it's going to flow through, like here's some more subarachnoid space. It flows through. In this picture, all the lighter blue area is subarachnoid space. So it flows all around this subarachnoid space. The darker blue is that dural venous sinus that we talked about before. So remember where the two layers of dura mater separate from each other and form that triangular shaped gap? That's the dural venous sinus. So then these little things here, the little tree-like things, do you remember that? That is an arachnoid villus. And that's where the cerebrospinal fluid drains into the blood. So it's going to circulate through the brain and spine in the subarachnoid space. And through that central canal of the spine. And through your ventricles. So it's made in the brain ventricles, then it flows out into the spinal canal and subarachnoid space. Then it drains through those arachnoid villi into a dural venous sinus. And this is also draining blood. So now the fluid is returned to the blood. So then if we look at the functions of this cerebrospinal fluid, as it's flowing through, it is nourishing the brain because it has glucose, it has electrolytes. So it nourishes your brain and spine. And since it is a custom selected fluid where it keeps the waste products out, things that are harmful to the brain out, it is protecting your brain from being exposed to harmful things in your blood. And it provides buoyancy. Buoyancy means floating. Your brain actually floats inside your head. If you look at this picture, see how all along the bottom here, you have this cushion of cerebral spinal fluid? At no point is your brain actually touching your bones. Even like when you lay down, look here on the back, that cushion. So it provides this cushion between your brain and your bones. And your brain is actually floating inside your head in this fluid. And this is important because the brain is so soft that if it weren't floating, it would crush under its own weight. And you can get a brain herniation where if you lose your cerebral spinal fluid, the brain right here, you have this hole in your skull, the foramen magnum, where your spine goes through. The brain can actually sit on the base of the skull here, and it will start to crush and ooze out through there. And that's a brain herniation. So that's what can happen if you don't have enough cerebral spinal fluid. You can also have a problem of having too much cerebral spinal fluid. So the right amount is important. If you have not enough, then your brain will crush because it'll crush under its own weight. It can even herniate through the foramen magnum. And if you have too much, that is a condition called hydrocephalus. Today there is medical treatment for it, but it used to be a fatal condition. And it tends to be in babies where you can see here there's a blockage right here where the fluid can't drain out of the ventricles. And it keeps building up, and here you can see enlarged ventricles, and those enlarged ventricles will crush the brain. So if there's too much, it will build up and crush the brain from the inside out. And if babies have this because their skull is not fused yet, their whole head will enlarge from it. But luckily today there is medical treatment. They can do surgery and install a shunt. And that shunt drains the excess fluid. And it just drains it to the stomach. Then another thing protecting the brain is the blood-brain barrier. This involves another glial cell called the astrocyte. So here is an astrocyte. And the astrocyte has these extensions called perivascular feet. And notice how they wrap around the blood vessel. So the astrocyte has perivascular feet that wrap around the blood vessel. Any substance in the blood that wants to go into the brain has to be allowed through by these astrocytes. So they act like a bouncer. So they are what allow substances in the blood to enter the brain. So if there's something bad in the blood that they don't like, they don't let it through. They do have a weakness. And that weakness is lipid-soluble molecules. You can see here this yellow one is showing lipid-soluble. See how here this is a glucose? It goes between the perivascular feet. Look at the lipid-soluble. It goes through the perivascular foot. Cell membranes are lipid, and the astrocyte is a cell, so it has a lipid cell membrane. So substances that are lipid soluble can pass through the membrane. So this, for example, is how you get drunk. Alcohol is bad for your brain. But it is lipid soluble. So even though your brain doesn't want it because it's harmful, it can get through the blood-brain barrier. So there's the remainder of the things that protect your brain. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These are nerves that go straight from the brain to the effector. They do not pass through the spine. Each nerve has a name and a Roman numeral. So we're going to go through the 12 pairs of nerves and see what they do. And I'm not going through every detail of every function of each nerve. I'm just giving you the highlights of what these nerves do. So the first one is number 1, which is the olfactory. So I have little clues here to go with it. So I have an olfactory to help you remember the name olfactory. And there is some perfume here. You smell perfume. So the olfactory nerve carries your sense of smell. And that is CN1. That's why it has a Roman numeral 1. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic. And if you know that old police song, I'll Be Watching You, you can think of that for the optic nerve. This nerve is what carries vision. Next we have oculomotor. So think of root words. If you break this down, oculo, remember when we were talking about muscles? And you have the orbicularis oculus. So this refers to eye, and then motor is going to have something to do with movement. So one of the things this nerve does is it moves your eyes. And you use extrinsic muscles to move your eyes. So extrinsic muscles are the muscles on the outside of your eyeball. Okay, in my clue here, I have annoyed pupils. So that's a little pun. Think of pupils as students and pupils also as those little holes in your eyes where light enters. So this muscle or this nerve controls the size of your pupils because it will stimulate your iris. Your iris is the muscle that controls the size of your pupil, and it will stimulate your iris to constrict your pupil. Okay, then they roll their eyes, that's the movement, and then stare off into space. That has to do with your lens. Your lens is the part of your eye that focuses. So when you're looking up close and reading, or when you're looking far away, you have to change your lens. And that is the ciliary muscle that makes your lens focus. So the oculomotor does those 3 things. Then next we have the trochlear nerve. This one will also cause eye movement. So it's going to stimulate your extrinsic muscles. to cause eye movement. Okay, then the fifth one is trigeminal. And I know this is kind of tricky because you think a tri, it should be 3, but it's not. It's number 5. So that's why I have a 5-year-old boy, so you can remember it's number 5. Okay, he chewed his gum. So this nerve stimulates the masseter muscle, which is what makes you chew. The gum was warm and soft. So that's general sensory from your tongue. Remember that you have taste and you also have temperature and texture of your food. So this, the gum was warm and soft, tells us that it is carrying general sensory from the tongue, which is the temperature and texture of your food. Okay, then he blew a bubble and he felt it on his face. So it also does general sensory of your face and head. So that's going to be like touch and temperature of anything that's on your face or your head. Then we can move to abducens, which is number 6. So I have here 6-pack abs. So you can think of number 6 and it's abducens. It starts with an AB. And this one is also eye movement. And see how her eyes are looking to the side? That's called abducting your eyes. Think of chapter 9, like when you lift your arm out to your side, that was abduction of your arm. If you make your eyes move to the side, that's abduction of your eyes. So this one is also going to be extrinsic muscles to move the eyes. Okay, then number 7 is facial. So I have 7 dwarfs, so you can think of the number 7. And the first part's pretty simple. It's the facial nerve, and it is responsible for your facial expressions. Think about how much you can tell by looking at somebody's face and the expressions they make. That's your facial nerve that does that. Also, it says the 7 dwarfs make faces while crying and spitting about food. Well, when you cry, you have tears. So this nerve stimulates the lacrimal glands. These are glands above your eyes, and they make tears. So it's not just when you're crying, you always need tears in order to keep your eyes clean. And then spitting. So this is going to stimulate the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. And they will make saliva. And then the reason they're crying and spitting about food is taste. So your sense of taste comes through the facial nerve, and it is taste from the anterior part of your tongue. So we have a different nerve coming up that's going to carry taste from the posterior part of the tongue. Then we can move on to number 8 is vestibulocochlear. So this one comes from your ear, and it comes from 2 different parts of your ear. That's what it's named for. The vestibule of your ear has your sense of balance. Which is also sometimes referred to as equilibrium. And then the cochlea of your ear is the part where your hearing is. So this nerve comes from your ear, connects your ear to your brain, and it has your balance and your hearing. Number 9 is glossopharyngeal. So he uses spit to make his food glossy. So this stimulates the parotid salivary gland. Makes saliva. Makes his food glossy so he can taste it. So this is taste from the posterior part of the tongue. It is also general sensory for the tongue. So this is another one telling you the temperature and texture of your food. And then this nerve is also involved in making you swallow your food. If you think of its name, glossopharyngeal, this part refers to the pharynx, which is your throat. And when you swallow food, it goes into your throat. All right. Number 10 is the vagus. This is going to be the cranial nerve we talk about the most in future chapters. You're going to have a lot of stuff about the vagus. So the vagus nerve does a lot of parasympathetic activity. It is going to stimulate your heart, and it's going to cause it to slow down. So your heart beats on its own, but your brain can tell it to speed up or slow down, and your brain uses the vagus to slow down. It's going to stimulate your digestive system and tell it to work harder on digesting your food. So it stimulates the digestive system. And in your respiratory system, it's going to stimulate bronchoconstriction. So it makes your airways narrow. And it also carries sensory from all of these abdominal and thoracic organs to your brain. Okay. Number 11 is the accessory. So I have the necklaces here because necklaces are an accessory. And this little girl is shrugging her shoulders and tilting her head. So this is two muscles. It stimulates the trapezius. This is the muscle that makes you shrug your shoulders. And the sternocleidomastoid. So we've already learned these muscles. If you remember, the sternocleidomastoid is in your neck, and this is the muscle that makes you tilt your head. And like if you put your chin down on your chest, that is your sternocleidomastoid. And then the last one is hypoglossal. This nerve is what makes you move your tongue. All right, so there are your 12 cranial nerves and an overview of what they do.